Throughout my life, I've encountered prejudice countless times, but what happened on that flight was unlike anything else. Silent disdain hidden behind polite masks, exclusion unspoken but deeply felt. That day wasn't just a journey, it was a test. And when the truth of who we were emerged, everyone's masks fell. The moment I stepped into the airport, I felt a familiar tension. Every face, every glance in the crowd reminded me of a world that wasn't ours. James walked beside me, calm and confident as always. His serene demeanor always reassured me, but today, I noticed even he seemed a little on edge. Maybe this time was different. As we approached the check-in counter, I held James's hand tightly while we waited in line. "Let's just smile, like always," I whispered softly. James looked into my eyes and nodded. Always. We stepped up to the counter, greeted by a woman named Karen. At first glance, Karen seemed cheerful and polite, but the moment she saw us, I noticed her fake smile freeze for a split second. She scanned us up and down, her expression barely hiding a subtle condescension. "IDs and tickets, please," she said curtly in a cold tone. James handed over our IDs and tickets with his usual polite smile. "We're so excited to be flying with Horizon Air," he said warmly, but his kindness couldn't melt Karen's icy demeanor. As she examined our tickets, her eyebrows raised slightly. "James and Amelia Walker," she repeated, her tone indifferent. Then she looked up at us again. "Cutting it a bit close for this flight, aren't we? If you want better seats next time, I suggest booking earlier." James's smile faltered slightly, but he remained composed. "Actually, these are first-class tickets," he said calmly. Karen's eyes widened momentarily before she quickly masked her reaction. "Of course," she said with a fake laugh. "Sorry about that. Sometimes these things slip by." She placed our tickets on the counter, then immediately turned to the next passengers. "Next!" I lightly touched James's arm. "Let it go," I said softly. He simply nodded, but the look in his eyes said it all. At security, the tension escalated. While other passengers passed through effortlessly, we were pulled aside for a random check. They opened our bags, made us take off our shoes and belts, and scrutinized everything with an air of suspicion. They even inspected my lotion bottle. "Is this over the limit?" one officer asked, their tone as if searching for an excuse to call me guilty. "No, it's well within regulations," I said, trying to stay calm, but the slight tremor in my voice betrayed my frustration. Behind us, a woman muttered under her breath. "Why are they being checked so thoroughly?" she asked mockingly. "Who knows? Maybe they've got something in their bags," another person added. I squeezed James's hand and looked at him. "This is ridiculous," I whispered. James took a deep breath and addressed the security officer. "It's fine. Do your job," he said, though his tone of patience sounded forced. Finally, we retrieved our bags and headed toward the gate. I clung tightly to James's hand. "Are you okay?" I asked him. "The usual," he replied, but his expression was harder than usual. At the gate, Karen was there again. She looked surprised to see us, but quickly replaced her expression with another fake smile. "I hope you enjoy your flight," she said. James handed over our tickets without a word, offering only a brief glance. As we walked through the boarding gate, I felt a familiar pang. They didn't see us, just judged us as passengers without knowing who we truly were. But I knew everything would change once they found out. I leaned into James and whispered, "Wait until they find out who we are." With a faint smile, James replied, "They don't know yet." But the determination in his voice told me this was just the beginning. As we stepped into the plane, the discomfort in my chest grew stronger. The first-class cabin, with its spacious seats and tranquil ambiance, should have promised relaxation. But for us, those seats would become the stage of a silent battle. James sat down, his face calm, but I could feel the tension beneath his composed exterior. Our eyes met, speaking without words. "Let's be patient." As we settled in, Karen appeared again, her fake smile plastered on her face and her tone dripping with forced politeness. "Would you like something to drink? Champagne, perhaps?" she asked. Before James could respond, I answered, "Just water, thank you." The mocking expression that flashed across Karen's face unsettled me. "Of course, water," she said, turning away and muttering something under her breath. Though we couldn't hear the words, the tone spoke volumes. When she returned with the water, she placed it on the table with an unnecessary force. It was such a small gesture that no one else noticed, but we felt the disrespect. James took a sip of the water and turned to me. "We need to ignore this, Amelia," he said quietly. "We can't always ignore it," I replied. "I know this happens all the time, but sometimes it's just too much." I began observing Karen as she served the other passengers. Her warmth and cheerful demeanor with them contrasted starkly with her coldness toward us. The laughter she shared with others was replaced by silence when she approached us. It was so obvious it felt like a deliberate effort. When meal service began, Karen returned. "Chicken or pasta?" she asked, her tone void of enthusiasm. "Pasta, please," I said calmly. James also chose pasta, but Karen placed the plates in front of us with such dismissive haste that it felt like she couldn't wait to move on. Without another word, she turned and walked away. James whispered, "She's ignoring us." "Remember when we've experienced this before?" I nodded. Yes, it was all too familiar. Such behavior usually wasn't expressed in words, but in actions. Yet this time, it felt different, as if Karen was intentionally trying to provoke us. Other passengers started noticing us, too. Behind us, a woman glanced at James's plate and whispered, "Why are they so quiet? I expected them to cause a scene," she said to the person next to her. Her words hit me like a punch, making it hard to breathe. James squeezed my arm gently and shook his head. "Let them talk," he said. In the silence of the first-class cabin, an invisible tension hung in the air. No words were spoken, but everyone seemed aware of the situation. The man across from us pretended to read his newspaper, though his eyes occasionally darted toward us. Others avoided looking at us entirely, acting as if nothing was happening. After we finished our meals, Karen returned to collect the plates. This time, she simply asked, "Finished?" Her voice carried no gratitude or warmth. "Thank you," I said, handing her the plates. But she didn't even look at me. James took a deep breath. "The usual," he said. But this time, his tone was different, like he was ready to take action. As the plane began its ascent, James and I locked eyes. "They don't know," I said. James gave a faint smile, but the determination on his face remained unchanged. "Not yet," he said. In this silent battle, we waited patiently. We knew that when the truth of who we were finally came out, everything would change. Until then, we endured these small, insidious attacks. Playing by their rules, we waited for our moment of triumph. As the plane climbed higher, the silence in the cabin gave way to a growing tension. James was turned toward the window, watching the clouds outside. To a stranger, he might have seemed perfectly calm, but I could see the deep patience and faintly concealed anger in his every glance. Karen's condescending attitude was like a cold wind cutting into us. After a while, Karen appeared again, this time with a tray of drinks. She served the other passengers with a wide smile, her laughter echoing through the cabin. But when she reached our row, that smile vanished in an instant. "What can I get for you?" she asked, her voice devoid of warmth or interest. James looked directly at her. "Just a glass of water, please," he said. As Karen placed the water on our table, she set it down with a sharp tap. Once again, this small gesture carried a message only we could understand. Without another word, she turned and walked away quickly. Looking around, I noticed other passengers observing the interaction. However, none of them intervened. Some pretended not to see anything, while others whispered among themselves, as if analyzing the situation. Yet they all avoided making eye contact. I squeezed James's hand. "This can't keep going," I said quietly. "Be patient, Amelia," he replied. "Everything has its time." But my patience was wearing thin. It was clear Karen was trying to humiliate us in front of the other passengers. Her actions weren't just the result of a flight attendant having a bad day. There was something deeper here, assumptions and prejudices about who we were. During the meal service, this became even more evident. Karen chatted with other passengers as she served them their meals, asking them about their flights and laughing warmly. But when she got to us, she didn't linger for even a moment. "Chicken or pasta?" she asked, her tone indifferent and cold. "Pasta," I replied. James chose the same. When she set our plates down, she practically tossed the cutlery onto the edge of the table. She said nothing, simply turned away and walked off without looking back. James's voice, calm and quiet, brought me back to reality. "We need to ignore this, Amelia," he said. "We can't play her game." But I was playing. My anger was growing. I could hear the whispers of the passengers around us. "Why are they so quiet?" one murmured. Another said, mockingly, "People like them usually make a scene." Those words sat in my throat like a lump. James leaned toward me. "Amelia," he said, his voice almost like a warning. "We know what to do when the time comes. For now, we just wait." But the waiting felt like punishment to me. Every mocking glance, every dismissive gesture tested my patience. Karen's warmth toward the other passengers and her cold distance toward us made it clear how deep her biases ran. Other passengers had noticed as well, yet none of them spoke up. Perhaps they feared disrupting their own comfort. They merely watched. A little while later, the plane hit some light turbulence. As we fastened our seatbelts, I noticed Karen walking down the aisle again. This time, she was serving drinks. She handed out wine and juice to the other passengers, smiling warmly and asking, "Can I get you anything else?" But when she reached our row, she set a bottle of water on the table and walked away without a word. This time, I couldn't hold back. "Excuse me," I called out. Karen stopped and turned around, her forced smile barely concealing her irritation. "Is there a problem?" "Yes, there is," I said. "Why are you withholding the same courtesy from us that you're showing to everyone else?" Karen's face froze for a moment. Then she shrugged slightly and said, "I thought you wanted water." Without waiting for a reply, she quickly walked away. James took my hand. "This is just the beginning," he said. "Wait, Amelia. You'll see how we win this." As the plane cruised through the sky, the cabin's silence turned into a stifled tension. James and I spent time talking quietly, but I couldn't help noticing Karen moving up and down the aisle again. Her small gestures of care, her warmth toward the other passengers. It was obvious. Yet every time she approached our row, her face turned cold, and her demeanor changed. This time, she carried a tray. She offered glasses of wine to other passengers, smiling brightly and asking, "Would you like anything else?" But when she reached us, she simply placed a bottle of water and a packet of salted peanuts on the table before quickly walking away. I couldn't stand it anymore. "Wait a minute," I called out, my voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers. Karen stopped abruptly and turned back, her expression blank. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone professional yet mocking. "Yes, there is," I replied. "Why don't you offer us the same options you give to everyone else?" Karen's face tensed for a moment, but she quickly composed herself, wearing her professional mask again. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "Oh, I'm sure you don't," I answered, my tone calm but firm. "But we notice the lack of courtesy, and just so you know, we're not the only ones who notice." My words made a few passengers lift their heads. A quiet ripple of curiosity spread through the cabin. Karen stood silent for a moment before quickly saying, "If you have a complaint, you can speak to the captain." Then she turned and walked away. James leaned toward me, his voice low. "Amelia, remember, this isn't a battle. Be patient." But patience felt like a burden. Each small insult, every act of disregard made my anger grow. I could hear the whispers of the passengers around us. "Why are they so sensitive?" someone muttered. Another voice, sarcastic, replied, "Maybe there's a reason." Those words fueled the storm inside me, but I chose not to escalate further out of respect for James. I held his hand, saying nothing, but my eyes scanned the faces of the other passengers. Some watched with detached expressions, others looked visibly uncomfortable, but no one questioned Karen's behavior. A short while later, Karen returned, claiming she needed to check our tickets. "I need to see your tickets," she said, loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "Our tickets?" I asked. "Yes," she replied. "It's a routine check." This time, James spoke firmly. "Routine? We haven't seen you check anyone else's tickets in this cabin." Karen hesitated briefly, then composed herself. "I'm just doing my job," she said. James pulled out his wallet and handed her our tickets. "Here, do your job." Karen glanced at the tickets briefly before handing them back quickly. Her eyes revealed a mix of anger and embarrassment, though she tried to mask it with forced professionalism. "Thank you," she said curtly and walked away. After this exchange, the cabin grew even quieter. The weight of other passengers' stares hung heavy in the air, though no one said a word. Despite James's calm exterior, I could sense his patience was wearing thin. "Everything has its time, Amelia," he said quietly. "Let them see this moment. Let them watch and understand." But I didn't want to remain a spectator. A growing rebellion stirred inside me. Our silent protest wasn't just directed at Karen. It was a message to everyone complicit in their silence. Balancing on the edge of anger and restraint, I knew something had to change. And that moment was fast approaching. As the plane continued its journey through the dark sky, the atmosphere in the cabin became unbearably tense. The passengers' whispers hadn't ceased. They had only grown louder. Karen continued moving up and down the aisle, blatantly ignoring us. It was as if we didn't exist, her deliberate refusal to meet our eyes becoming a sort of twisted game. James and I maintained a silent dialogue, holding hands tightly as we leaned on each other. Yet the anger growing within me was becoming harder to contain. Karen's belittling actions were not just directed at us. They sent a message to the entire cabin. You are not welcome here. After a while, the cabin lights dimmed and silence enveloped the space. But this wasn't the silence of peace. It felt more like the calm before a storm. Beside me, James still appeared composed, but I could sense that his patience was wearing thin. After years of enduring countless instances of discrimination, I knew the emotions inside him were building. Karen appeared again, this time with a tray of hot beverages and desserts. She smiled warmly and chatted as she served the other passengers. But when she reached our row, her warm expression vanished instantly. Without saying a word, she quickly passed us by, focusing her attention on the passengers ahead. "Wait a minute," I said, my voice raised, my patience finally gone. The sharpness in my tone caught the attention of the other passengers. Karen stopped, slowly turning to face me, her expression marked by mock surprise. "Yes, is there a problem?" she asked, her voice attempting a mask of professionalism but seething with underlying hostility. "Yes, there is a problem," I replied. "Why are we not being treated the same as the other passengers?" Karen's expression didn't waver, but I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. "I've given you everything you need. What more could you possibly want?" she said, her tone now openly mocking. James took a deep breath, preparing to speak, but I continued before he could. "Is completely ignoring us while serving hot drinks and desserts to everyone else what you consider everything we need?" For a moment, Karen seemed at a loss for words. Then she forced a fake smile back onto her face. "There must have been a misunderstanding," she said. "I can certainly bring you something now." "Don't bother," I replied firmly but calmly. "We've received your message loud and clear." My words caused a ripple of movement among the other passengers. Some watched the scene with visible discomfort, while others turned their faces away. The silence that followed hung in the air like an accomplice to Karen's actions. Karen said nothing more and turned quickly to walk away. James leaned toward me, lowering his voice. "She wasn't expecting that," he said. "But this isn't over, Amelia." He was right. This was just the beginning. Karen's actions weren't simply personal prejudices, they were a symptom of a much deeper, systemic problem. On this flight, we had become symbols of that issue. Just then, another passenger, a middle-aged man, leaned toward us and spoke softly. "I'm truly sorry," he said. "I should have stepped in." "Yes, you should have," I replied, my tone firm but not unkind. "But I appreciate you saying this now." The man lowered his head in shame and said nothing more. The whispers in the cabin slowly resumed. One passenger muttered, "Why are they making such a big deal?" Another responded, "Maybe they're exaggerating." James leaned closer to me and whispered, "See? They're already trying to make it seem like it's our fault." "Let them talk," I said, "because soon when they find out who we are, they'll have nothing to say." This plane was no longer just traveling through the sky. What was happening aboard it was forcing everyone to confront their own biases, their silence and their complicity. Like a brewing storm, this silence was on the verge of erupting. As the plane leveled out, the tension in the cabin grew heavier by the minute. James's hands rested on his knees, his fingers rhythmically tapping the table, a clear sign that he was both irritated and biding his time. I scanned the faces around us, noting how some passengers tried to act as though nothing was happening, while others couldn't hide their curiosity. A few openly stared, but no one dared to speak. Karen passed by once again, carrying an empty tray. She ignored us completely, moving swiftly down the aisle. Her blatant disregard fueled my anger even more, but I looked to James's calm demeanor as a reminder to keep my composure. I knew that winning this battle required more than an emotional outburst. It required strategy. At that moment, the intercom crackled to life. The captain's calm, authoritative voice echoed through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on tonight's flight. We'd like to take a moment to share a special announcement. On board this evening, we are honored to have the esteemed owners of Horizon Air, James and Amelia Walker. Please join us in welcoming them and thanking them for flying with us." The captain's words shattered the silence in an instant. Shock rippled through the cabin, reflected clearly on the passengers' faces. Karen froze mid-step a few rows ahead, gripping her tray tightly. Her eyes widened, and her face displayed utter disbelief. The condescension she had shown earlier evaporated in an instant. James leaned back in his seat, his expression calm but his sharp gaze revealing he had anticipated this moment. I, meanwhile, watched Karen's face closely. It was the look of someone watching their prejudices crumble. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but couldn't form the words. A nearby passenger, a middle-aged man in a suit, broke the silence. Leaning toward us, he asked, "Is it really you?" His voice was a mix of awe and embarrassment. James nodded calmly. "Yes, it's us." The man paused before leaning back, visibly ashamed. "In that case, I feel I owe you an apology," he murmured. "You don't owe us an apology," I said, meeting his gaze. "What you need to question is what your silence and thoughts have told you about yourself." Karen finally moved, walking toward us hesitantly. Her gaze was downcast, her face flushed with shame. Setting the tray aside, she stammered, "Mr. and Mrs. Walker. I'm so sorry, I didn't know." James's expression remained neutral, but his voice was steady and firm. "It doesn't matter that you didn't know. What matters is how you treated people when you thought no one would notice. Don't apologize to us. Apologize to your own biases." Karen's breathing grew heavier as she fought back tears. "I never realized I could come across this way," she said, her voice trembling. "Perhaps that's something you needed to realize," I replied, my tone quiet but resolute. "Today we were recognized for who we are. But next time, consider how you treat passengers whose names you'll never know." Karen nodded slightly, retreating quickly. The weight of the silence in the cabin remained, but this time it carried a mix of shame and awareness. Passengers avoided each other's gazes, their faces reflecting an inner reckoning. James reached for my hand. "You know, Amelia," he said softly, This might be the first awakening they've ever had. Even if it's late, it's something. He was right. This was a small crack in a system that wouldn't change overnight, but the sum of these cracks could eventually bring down walls. It only required people to start understanding that silence, too, is a choice. As the plane began its descent, the atmosphere in the cabin was heavy. The silence reflected the turmoil inside the passengers. Their expressions oscillated between guilt, shame, and newfound awareness. They were still processing the truth revealed during the announcement. The fact that James and I were the owners of Horizon Air had become a mirror for the biases they had quietly harbored. When the plane came to a full stop, the passengers hurriedly gathered their belongings. The whispers grew louder, but there was an unease in their movements. James and I remained seated, silently supporting each other as we waited for everyone else to disembark. This wasn't just our story. It was a truth everyone needed to confront. At that moment, Karen emerged from the galley and approached us. She had changed out of her uniform into simple attire. Her expression was indescribable, a mix of regret, shame, and fear. Her gaze was fixed on the floor, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "Mr. and Mrs. Walker," she began, her voice trembling, "I'm truly sorry. What I did to you, it was unacceptable. I want to apologize for my behavior." James stared at her, unflinching. "What does this apology mean, Karen?" he asked, his voice calm but probing. Karen lifted her head to meet his gaze, her eyes brimming with tears. "I'm trying to understand how my actions made you feel. I wasn't even aware of my own biases. But now I see them. From now on, I'll be more mindful. I'll be a better person." I took a deep breath. "Karen," I said, my tone gentle but resolute, "this apology shouldn't end here with us. Can you carry this awareness forward to the next passenger, the next encounter? This can't just be a moment of regret." Karen nodded emphatically. "Yes," she said. "I will. I'll make sure of it. I'll learn." Just then, a group of airline executives appeared at the plane's door to meet us. Their expressions were markedly different from those of the passengers, an uneasy blend of respect and damage control. They shook our hands, but no words were exchanged. One executive said, "Mr. and Mrs. Walker, we'd like to discuss this flight with you." James looked at him and gave a brief nod. "We've prepared a VIP lounge for you at the airport," the man added. "I'd prefer to start this conversation here and now," James replied. His voice was firm, carrying authority without the intent to humiliate. In the airport's VIP lounge, a meeting was held with the executives. Karen, along with other staff members, was present. James's voice resonated with patience but unwavering determination. "This isn't just about us. This is a systemic issue. You need to question how you train your staff, how you lead, and what values you instill in your organization." An executive hesitated before replying, "Of course, we'll work on this issue." But James wasn't satisfied with vague assurances. "No," he said, his tone steady but pointed. "You won't work on it. You will solve it. And these solutions won't be just words. They will bring tangible change." As Amelia, I added, "This is a matter of humanity. It's your responsibility to ensure everyone is treated equally and fairly. We're just the visible ones, but there are hundreds of invisible people who face these prejudices every day." During the conversation, Karen remained silent, but her face betrayed profound embarrassment. After the meeting ended, she approached me and said quietly, "I need to thank you. You forced me to confront myself." I looked at her and replied, "That thanks will only mean something in your next actions, not here." As James and I left the airport, we were tired but resolute. This was just one step in a battle that would take years, but every step could deepen the cracks in a flawed system. One day, those cracks would bring the entire wall down. Between us, there was a silent understanding. This fight wasn't just for us, it was for humanity. On the next flight, in the next encounter, we would continue to act with this awareness. Because change, above all, begins with awareness.